Do not rush. You got plenty of time.
Going now. Yeah.
Radio by Jack Odell, Chair of the Board of Directors of Pacifica. The statement commemorating the uprising in Soweto 10 years ago is made pursuant to a resolution of that board. Here is Mr. Odell.
This is the first time in Pacifica's 37-year history as the pioneer in listener-supported radio we have taken the decision to editorialize. We fought in the courts for that right, and we won. Now we are acting in the exercise of that right. The special circumstances motivating us to take such a step is the 10th anniversary of the uprising in Soweto, which the world observes on June the 16th of this year. On the eve of this significant anniversary, the scale and depth of the mood of the people of South Africa is one resembling a revolutionary upsurge. Their uncompromising, organized resistance to apartheid is continuing to grow. The international prestige and authority of the ANC are rising to new heights. The liberating ideas of the Freedom Charter, which declares the human rights agenda freeing all South Africans to live in a society of democracy, is daily gaining new supporters, especially among the white youth in South Africa. This is a great revolutionary moment in the life of the freedom movement. Yet it may also be a moment marked by unprecedented bloodshed and enormous personal sacrifices by the freedom fighters of South Africa as a dying regime seeks to defend itself. The apartheid rulers can no longer govern the country except through brutal, terroristic methods. The heroism of the struggling people of South Africa has inspired progressive humanity everywhere to strengthen its movements of solidarity. The isolation of the racist apartheid regime from the international community is increasing. The people of the United States are part of that progressive humanity. Our movements for peace and justice confirm that reality. We must make our voices heard from every corner of this country, demanding the Reagan administration stop supporting the Botha regime in South Africa. Any support for apartheid by this administration makes our nation a collaborator and an ally of South Africa's repressive, militaristic policies. I urge all of our listeners to telephone, wire, or write President Reagan today, insisting that his administration break with apartheid immediately and absolutely. The conscience and honor of our country is at stake, and the struggle continues. This is Pacifica Radio.
The preceding editorial statement was delivered by Jack Odell, Chair of the Board of Directors of Pacifica Radio. Should you wish to express your views on the matter to the government, you may call the White House comment line in Washington, D.C.
Good evening. My name is Bill Fletcher. Welcome to an online discussion sponsored by the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism, a discussion celebrating the life and work of the iconic Jack Odell, who passed away in 2019 and whose voice you just heard from a broadcast that had been issued by Pacifica several decades past. We have a wonderful opportunity this evening to engage in a discussion with a great panel that's going to look at different aspects of the life and work of our late friend. And each of these panelists are going to introduce themselves, and we're going to be handling this much like a television talk show. So what you will not be experiencing is speech after speech. We'll be having a discussion, sort of think of it as a family discussion about our friend and comrade. There's a few ground rules. We've asked each of the panelists to keep their points concise, not going on and on. And as the moderator, unfortunate or fortunate task of cutting people off if they go on too long. And I don't want anyone to take that personally. I don't want any of you, the viewers and listeners, to think that I'm disrespecting someone. There will be questions. There will be time for questions. And during the course of this, should you have a question that you want to pose to the panel, please go to the chat function and introduce that question. And we will make every effort to pose the question. We'll try to get to them. We're obviously more than likely not going to be able to get to all of them. So we're going to have the panelists introduce themselves, and in this order, Jane Power, Nikhil Singh, James Campbell, Sharon Maeda, Leslie Cagan, Gene Bruskin, and Mike Zweig. And so with no further ado, is Jane on the line?
Yeah, I'm here.
Welcome, Jane. You want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Jane Power, and I've been with Jack for 46 years, since January 1973, and over the years found out more and more about the person that I was fortunate enough to have gotten connected with, and learned more and more from him, and also found ways to introduce subjects to him or ideas to him in an effective way. And we had a wonderful time. I was very proud always of the people who gathered around Jack. I mean, you could have gotten an assessment of who Jack was, what he stood for, and his character by looking at everybody around him. So I'm very happy this evening to have some of those people here to talk about Jack and what he meant to them. And I guess I can just say what he meant to me was all the best things in life. And although I miss him, I don't feel as though he's gone. So I'll just pass that along to the next person.
Thank you, Jane. And we're doing quick introductions, and then I'll be posing some questions. Nikhil.
Hi, everybody. I'm Nikhil Singh. I teach history at New York University. I got to know Jack starting around 2004. We worked together pretty intensively for about 5 years on the book that became Climbing Jacob's Ladder, the Black Freedom Movement writings of Jack O'Dell. And Jack and Jane have been dear and close friends to me ever since. And I had the opportunity to see Jack often in the years, even after I moved away from the Pacific Northwest to New York. And I miss him terribly, but it's wonderful to hear Jane, and I'm looking forward to hearing everyone else who had important connections to Jack speak tonight.
James Campbell.
Hi, Bill. Jack and I met in New York City in 1958 as he and Bide Rustin were setting up the Southern Christian Leadership Conference office in Harlem. And Jack was also a new arrival in New York. And I had just secured a large apartment. So we became apartment mates, and I joined as a volunteer in the Southern Christian Leadership Harlem office. Over the years, we've worked together on many key issues, discussed and analyzed many issues until 1973, when Jack relocated to Washington, D.C., and I departed the country for Tanzania. I miss him very much in the conversations we used to have.
Thank you. Sharon.
I first met Jack in 1980 when I applied for the job of executive director of Pacifica Radio. And I must say that the whole rest of the job interview was kind of a blank when I was introduced to him, because I had followed him through Freedom Way's civil rights journal that he edited. I feel very fortunate that in recent years, when Jack and Jane retired to Vancouver and I moved back home to Seattle, I was able to spend time with Jack and Jane over long, long meals, both in Seattle and in Vancouver. He was a historian, a teacher, a mentor, but I also think he was a prophet.
Thank you. Leslie.
Hi everyone. Glad you're all here with us tonight. I think Jack and I met sometime in the late 70s, but we first really worked closely together on the massive nuclear disarmament demonstration in New York City on June 12th in 1982. We then went on to work on other peace struggles, and in the late 1980s, I became deeply involved in the Rainbow Coalition and again worked very closely with Jack. Our connection lasted for many years, although in the last number of years we didn't see each other very much, but he was always not only in my heart, but in my head. Every political crisis that came along, I thought about Jack.
Thank you, Leslie. Gene.
I met Jack in 1990 through Jane when I moved into their apartment in Adams Morgan, moved into their building. And I began working at the National Rainbow Coalition as Jesse's labor deputy and worked with Jack in the same office for a couple of years. And subsequently, my wife Evie and I and Jane and Jack became friends for the next 30 years. Spent many vacations and a lot of time together, and it was just always priceless.
Thank you. Mike Zweig.
Hi, I'm Mike Zweig. I first met Jack in the fall of 1990 as the U.S. was preparing to go to war in their first Gulf War. There was a planning committee and a coalition to oppose that war. And we had our first big mass march in Washington in January 1991. Jack was the chair of that committee. I was there representing the International Jewish Peace Union. And we continued our anti-war work. We continued to be friends, became friends, continued to be friends, saw each other in DC and then later in Vancouver and in Seattle. And it was just an honor and a pleasure to work with him and to know him and to learn from him. And I'm just very happy to be here with everybody else on this occasion.
Thank you. Let's start with Nikhil. Jane gave an introduction to this, but I want to ask you to follow up. Who was this Jack O'Dell? Where did he come from?
Well, I guess I would just, to set the table a little bit, I know a lot of you have really intimate knowledge of working with Jack in different parts of his life, but Jack really embodied the three great social upheavals and social movements of the second half of the 20th century. He came out of Detroit. He got his start as a labor radical working in the Merchant Marines during World War II. And during that time, I think he imbibed the labor left radicalism that had emerged through the founding of the CIO, which pushed the New Deal project forward. He began to see the world, and in seeing the world as he traveled around on the ships, he understood that the world itself was in upheaval, and he began to understand the international movements for decolonization, which were continually a part of his political itinerary. And then he returned from the war with many African-American ex-soldiers and support personnel ready to fight for equal justice, racial justice at home. So he was part of a kind of new spirit of Black civic restiveness that was going to then transform the next 30, 40 years of American political life. Jack was at the heart of all of those struggles, the labor movement, the movement for global justice, and the movement for Black freedom. And they were kind of formed an indissoluble whole for him. And he made contributions to all three movements. And that's one of the things that I think made him such a remarkable figure for us to to reconsider, to continue to learn from. And he informed so many of our most important political struggles along the way.
James Campbell, you said you met Jack in 1958. The SCLC was coming into existence, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. How was it that this black leftist found himself right smack in the middle of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference?
I think that was started really in 1946 earlier, coming out of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, a major meeting in Columbia, South Carolina. And Jack was a representative from Florida to that conference that was held in Columbia, South Carolina. And there he met Esther Jackson and Dorothy Burnham and Davis, Louise Jackson, spoke at that conference. And as the movement turned to Montgomery, he saw the opportunity in civil rights as opposed to the organized and scientific left. And he saw the opportunity of he saw a qualitative change in that church in Montgomery, Alabama, and what was happening in the young people beginning to sit in. And I think those things came together. He had an epiphany, and a militant epiphany in that history of that movement. And I think he's been a constant. At root, he was an observer of the African-American history and struggle from its very beginning and its links to the Bill of Rights and the Constitution of this country, and that the movement was fulfilling the goals and aims of the American Revolution. That's how we ended up in Montgomery and that movement, I think.
Thank you. Nikhil, I want to come back to you for a second. One of the things that the right wing certainly has talked about when it comes to Jack, and it goes, you can see it in different historical works, was about him and King. And what I wanted to ask you is, how was it that that Jack made the decision to move away from SCLC? What was this role? What was the role of JFK and the FBI and all that?
Well, JFK and the FBI went right after Jack. I mean, they were trying to dig up dirt on King, obviously, constantly. I mean, the nefarious activities the FBI conducted against King are now pretty well known. But the thing that they went after King on in that period around 1960, 61, 62 was basically to say, you have communists in your organization. We know of two in particular, Stanley Levison and Jack O'Dell, and you have to distance yourself from these individuals, or we're going to have a lot of trouble getting civil rights legislation through Congress. And, you know, King gave some pushback and basically said, you know, I don't really care what a man's political past was. I care what he stands for, what his principles are. I mean, King wasn't exactly entirely 100% clear at that point on how he wanted to handle things. I think he knew he had a public relations problem. And my sense is that Jack essentially made it easy for him and said, you know, if you need me to resign, if you need me to leave the organization, you know, I will do so. And they had an understanding about that eventually, and Jack walked away. Jack's connections to the organized far left, his role as a communist in the 1950s was well known. He had been brought before the Senate Internal Security Committee under James Eastland, where he'd famously rebuked Eastland as a authoritarian dictator, essentially. And by that point, 1958, it was safe to come out from the underground. I mean, before 1958, any association with communists or the Communist Party would have landed you in jail. So you know, Jack was part of the far left. King knew he had been part of the far left. Jack moved into the civil rights movement. He had tremendous skills and talents that the civil rights movement needed, and King recognized that. But in that climate in the United States in the early 1960s, and frankly, today, if you're watching what's happening right now, red baiting for any kind of association with the far left was a kind of a kiss of death. And so it's one of the reasons why Jack is still not better known, not as well known as he should be, because I think that connection to the communist left was a mark against him throughout his entire life.
Jim, going back to you for a second, in the 1960s, Jack becomes instrumental in this magazine, Freedom Ways, and a lot of people, a lot of younger people, but not just younger people, are unfamiliar with that magazine. So if you could just briefly tell us, what was that magazine and what was Jack's role?
Remember when Jack came into SALC office in Harlem and he said, some friends of Dr. Du Bois are putting together a magazine based on the magazine that Robeson had, Freedom. And you may want to do an article every now and then. But it became, Freedom Ways, in essence, served as a mentor to SNCC and CORE and SCLC and young activists of the 60s, because the leadership of Freedom Ways was that group that had come out of that Southern Negro Youth Congress in Columbia, South Carolina. Esther, Dorothy, Ernest Kaiser, and artists, musicians, Ossie and Ruby. Ossie and Ruby weren't in Columbia, however. They were a part of the younger intergenerational group.
Ossie Davis and Ruby D.
Yeah, Ossie Davis and Ruby D.
Mm-hmm.
And, but those women and men, Louis Burnham, Dr. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Herbert Aptheker, Sally Davis, Angela's mother. That group became mentors through Freedom Ways for the movement leadership, the young radicals of the 60s. And they wrote, people in SNCC, people in CORE, people who were active in all aspects of the 60s uprisings were contributors to Freedom Ways, in conjunction to the anchoring articles that came from elders. So there was that intergenerational correspondence that went on. It is still worthwhile for young people to read that today. I think it's one of the most valuable references today. And if I may, I would add to Freedom Ways that essay that introduces Climbing Jacob Ladder by Nikhil Pal Singh. It is a major contribution to the kind of work and the kind of long view and the centrality of the African-American freedom movement to this country in fulfilling the American Revolution that he has made a contribution to. Freedom Ways and Learn Your Horn are two good, solid expressions of what Jack's contribution is.
Thank you.
Yes.
Jane, I want to come back to you. You and Jack were together 46 years. What were your first impressions and what was the context in which you met him?
Hello?
Jane.
Oh, no, I had something said in my ear you were unmuted, but apparently I'm not.
Yes, you are.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, no, there's a voice that keeps breaking in here, but it seems to be an irrelevant voice. Some sort of operator. So I will just ignore that. Go ahead, folks.
So I was saying you and Jack were together 46 years. What were your impressions when you first met him, and what was the context in which you met him?
Well, he was teaching U.S. history. I was working for the National Education Association, which is a big union of teachers based in Washington, D.C. And on the way home, I passed on a residential street a little house where I came to understand they'd set up Antioch University, or Antioch College at the time, had set up a master's degree in education. So I said, well, I'm writing for teachers. I need to know what how teachers are educated and what they think, and so I'm going to take the course. So I took the course, got the master's in education, and part of the curriculum in this little house where you could get classes on your way home, because the other students were teachers, everybody was working, but you could get classes in after work and in the evening about basically economic history. You could get classes in Marxism. It was just a very good postgraduate program of basically read studies. So Jack was teaching a U.S. history course there. It was a year course. I took that, and the second semester he was teaching it was sort of an empire, general colonial history course, starting with the Portuguese in 1440 and running all the way down through the United States. So once I had those two courses, well, at a certain point I was at a conference about a paper with Jack as my professor, and he asked me whether I liked Indian food. That was kind of the beginning, and whether I liked the ballet. He said, "Mrs. Power, do you like the ballet?" I said, "Oh yes, I do like the ballet." And so we went out to get Indian food. Eventually, we got to the ballet, but that was how it started. It was early 1973. I'd been in his class for one semester and was starting the second one, and I just he was very quiet. He was very, very sweet, not pushy, and I sort of kept seeing him, and well, I kept seeing him for 46 years.
Oh, that's a good run. That's wonderful.
It was. It's been just lovely. Yeah.
Well, the two of you are a great couple, and it was always inspiring to see the two of you together, and the impact that each of you had on one another, which I think was just an incredible. It was very romantic and a wonderful model for us.
Well, the 46 years, I think, had a lot to do with it. I mean, every year, of course, we knew each other better, and we were able to trust each other more, and we learned more about how to communicate with each other. So the time was a really valuable part of that, building on and building on, so that we could get closer together and trust each other more and take care of each other more. So we were lucky that we had that amount of time that we could get to the point that we did.
Indeed.
And I might add, now I understand why whenever I was with the two of you, 9 times out of 10, Jack wanted to go to an Indian restaurant.
There you go.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So Leslie, you mentioned the anti-nuclear demonstration in 1982, and I want you to talk a little bit about that. I mean, one of the things that strikes me is that very often Black activists are pigeonholed so that we are only supposed to focus on race and something that's explicitly about race and particularly about Black folks. And all of a sudden you find this Black guy right smack in the middle of the planning of one of the biggest demonstrations in US history. How did that happen?
It's a complicated story, actually. I won't go into all the gory details right now, but suffice it to say that the coalition that was organizing what became this historic demonstration had a lot of internal problems, a lot of disagreements. It was very contentious. And at some point, and I don't remember exactly who raised it, but some months before the actual demonstration, somebody said, gee, maybe it would help us if Jack O'Dell could play a more active role. And I think in part his name came up because we already knew, those of us who knew him, of course, and others who had heard of him, already knew that he had a very deep internationalist perspective. And he was at that point already very close to Reverend Jackson, had been for some time already. And Jackson also had a very strong, always had, and still to this day, has always had a very strong peace and international solidarity perspective. So someone said, Jack is the kind of guy that not only will bring a political perspective, but can maybe bring a little clarity and sensitivity and calmness to this coalition. And somebody called him again, I'm sorry, I don't remember who it was now, and he said, sure, I'll help out. And he came on board. For the first few months, he was in and out of New York a lot. He had other responsibilities, but he played an incredibly important role within the coalition, which of course then translated into our ability, or impacted in a very strong and healthy way, our ability to carry out the work we had set out to do, which was organizing this massive mobilization. He had the what I thought, and still to this day see as an almost uncanny ability to listen to people. All too often, I'm sure many people on this call have been in this kind of experience where we're in a quote conversation with people, but we're not really listening. We're not really hearing what other people are saying. Jack had the ability to hear what people were saying, integrate it in, put it back out to the coalition, the committee, the group, whatever, but never losing sight or never losing his grounding in his own principles. So it wasn't like he would just agree with whatever anybody else was saying, but that ability to listen made it possible for him to help the coalition, the different parts of the coalition, understand each other so much better than they would have without his presence. And I think that was one of the most important contributions that Jack made to that effort. It was, as it was often the case with Jack, not necessarily a public role. It was a more behind, not in spotlight, a more behind the scenes, but critical role in helping to sustain a coalition. And it wasn't until many years later that I actually learned that I realized that I had learned a great deal about coalition dynamics and trying to manage coalitions just by working with Jack in that experience, and then in ongoing years and other experiences as well.
What happened after the mobilization? Was there an ongoing project that Jack was involved with, or did things disperse?
Things unfortunately dispersed, and I think there were a variety of reasons for that, not the least of which, as I said, it was a very contentious coalition, and it would have been really a tremendous challenge to keep that coalition together. There were, as is often the case with coalitions, each organization, put aside some of its own agenda, its own work in order to do this project. When the project was over, people were pulled back into their agendas. So again, we're into mid-82, and remember, Jackson's first presidential run was in '84. I'm sure, within that dynamic with Reverend Jackson, there were already, Jack was already on overload with his work with the Reverend. And I can't help but wonder how much, even by then, by 1982, were they beginning to have discussions about a possible presidential bid.
Nikhil, going back to you for a second, how did Jack get connected with Reverend Jackson? in the first place?
Well, Jack went back to run SCLC as an interim director after King's death. So that was kind of a ironic turnabout, given the fact that he had been essentially pushed out less than 10 years earlier. So they brought Jack back as somebody who, you know, as I think Leslie is pointing to, was someone who had tremendous credibility as someone who could knit together fractious forces. And of course, by 1969, the movements were very fractious and were coming apart along many seams. There was obviously tremendous tension and upheaval in the streets, and politically, of course, the right was beginning to really coalesce against the movements of the 60s. So, and that's really where Jack and Jesse became connected. And then when Jesse decided to push off and form Push, a sort of new organization, Jack went with him and served initially, as in my understanding, as his primary advisor on international affairs, because Jack had so much international experience. And of course, you see that imprint throughout the 70s in the kind of turn towards solidarity movements in relationship to South Africa and Palestine and elsewhere. So, so that course that Jack took really moved him from SCLC to Push and the Reverend Jackson in an effort to kind of find again a sort of a new impetus to move forward the movements for social justice. And in some ways, it really characterizes Jack's entire life, that he was always looking for the next opening, the next possibility, the next place where he thought he could be useful. And so that's sort of my best account that I can give of that. And of course, he was with Reverend Jackson then for really the rest of his time as an active political agent in the United States.
And Mike, there was a point you wanted to make about the '88 Atlanta Democratic Convention that you said fit in
Yeah, this
here.
just follows on this internationalism. You know, I was at the '88 convention in Atlanta with the International Jewish Peace Union, and we had picked up on Jesse's campaign about recognizing Palestinian rights. And that was, of course, came out of Jack. I didn't know that at the time, but we had a flyer. I remember standing on the street outside the convention hall, handing out a flyer supporting this Jackson plank on Palestine. It was the only time in my life I ever handed out a leaflet where people took it, walked down the street, and then came back to give me a hug. And it never happened to me before. But that was Jack, even though I didn't know it at the time. And I just always wanted to acknowledge that and to thank him again for that participation and that influence in the Jackson campaign that was so very important.
Sharon, yeah.
This is Gene. I was going to make a comment.
Okay.
That I had the good fortune of working at the Rainbow a couple of years with Jack. Now we're talking about, we're in the early 90s when the National Rainbow Coalition was in Washington, D.C. And it was fascinating to watch the incredible respect that Reverend Jackson had for Jack when, you know, in a staff meeting or something, when Reverend would be putting out all kinds of ideas and people would be listening closely. And then at some point he would sort of turn to Jack to say, Jack, what do you think? And Jack was usually very diplomatic. If he disagreed, he would sort of understate that, and then they would sort of meet afterwards. And this was after decades of relationship where, you know, Jesse didn't turn to too many people for an okay. But I just wanted to sort of add to the fact that one of the great powers of Jack was his ability to listen. And that the first time I met him, Jane told me you should meet, you know, Jack O'Dell. I thought he was Irish, you know. And I went into their apartment and I'm sitting there and I would, you know, he started asking me questions about this new job I had with the union and what are you trying to accomplish? What are the main obstacles and all these things? And I'm looking around and there's a picture of this guy up on the mantle with Martin Luther King. And then there's another picture with him with Jesse. And then there's a picture with him with Yasser Arafat. And I'm sitting here trying to figure out who this guy is. And he's asking me these deep questions about what I'm trying to accomplish in the world. And by the time that conversation was over, like it took me like a few hours to like go downstairs and take a breath and recover and try and imagine, you know, who I'm dealing with. And that was sort of the way he was, you know.
Sharon, you saw another side of Jack in the work around Pacifica, and Jack was the chair of the board, if I'm not mistaken, of Pacifica. How did you see his leadership play out in Pacifica? What were some of the challenges that he was up against?
Well, first of all, as anyone who's known anything about Pacifica Radio over the decades, it's always in some kind of turmoil. And I really, what Leslie said about Jack bringing clarity, sensitivity, and calmness to a fractious situation, that was absolutely the case with Pacifica. He was the chair of the board from 1977 to 1997, 20 years. And his role changed with some of the things that were happening internally. He never wanted to be the person in on the stage, so to speak, and he rarely spoke on the air except for that incredible editorial, and I want to get back to that in a minute. But Pacifica, when I got there in 1980, was $1 million in debt and had a very strange management structure, which there was Jack as chair of the board, and then there was someone else as president of the board. And, you know, that's a formula made for disaster from the beginning. But that person told me on my first week on the job that Jack is this great international leader and he's very busy doing other things, so don't bother him. We're just honored to have him chair the board meetings. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, this is the person that was the editor of Freedom Ways. This is the person that worked with all these justice leaders around the world, and I'm supposed to only call on him about the agenda of the board meeting when all these things were happening in the organization. So I just started calling him. And it turns out that Jack had never said he wasn't available. In fact, he was always available. And I have to say that Pacifica Radio would probably not exist today if Jack had not intervened in his gentle, thoughtful way with so many of the incendiary internal struggles that happened in the course of the 6 years that I was there as executive director and throughout his tenure there. And I want to say a little bit about the editorial that we heard at the beginning of this webinar. Jack was very modest when he said we won. We went to the US Supreme Court and won the right for non-commercial broadcasters to editorialize. And we happened to be at a board meeting in Los Angeles when we got word from our stringer in Johannesburg, South Africa, that Botha's military forces were staging just outside of Soweto. They had tanks, they had all kinds of military hardware, and soldiers were arriving constantly. And this was in the week before the 10th anniversary of the Soweto uprising. And on that anniversary, the people were going to have a big commemoration where they were going to fill the streets and all of that. And our stringer said, look, there's going to be a bloodbath. Isn't there something we can do? So we went back to the board meeting, and the board immediately and unanimously agreed that we would do this editorial, and Jack was the person to do it. And he sat there for 5 minutes scratching some words down on his yellow notepad. And then he went into the studio and took one cut and did that editorial. We tagged it with the White House comment line, as you heard. And we later learned that we had multiple times blown out the White House comment line because listeners were calling in, not just the 5 Pacifica radio stations, but we sent it out to all the Pacifica affiliate stations and urged them to do their own editorial. And instead, they just carried Jack's. And I talked to a woman at the White House anonymously and said, have you been getting a lot of phone calls? And she said, oh my, yes. And the strange thing is, every hour between on the hour and 10 minutes after the hour, we keep getting these calls. And then it slows down. And then the next hour, it builds back up. And that's because we had decided to broadcast that same editorial every hour on the hour for a week. And our affiliate stations had done the same. And it was a true tribute to Jack that all these other disparate stations all over the country were willing to use Jack's voice instead of writing their own editorials. And we do believe that it saved the people of Soweto.
Mike, probably the last great journey for Jack politically was this effort that came to be known as the Democracy Charter. And it'd be useful if you could say something about how that came about and what the attempt was there.
Jack had this idea of a democracy charter for the United States based on his experience in South Africa. It's good to we've been talking about the Soweto. Jack was there in South Africa. He understood some things about how the African National Congress and the South African Communist Party had pulled together the entire social movement in South Africa around an anti-apartheid agenda. And central to that campaign in South Africa was what the South Africans called the Freedom Charter, which was written in 1954 and 1955. And it was issued through a People's Congress in South Africa. And what the Freedom Charter was a statement of principles and a statement of orientation for the movement against apartheid that was brought very broadly through all the civil society organizations, all the unions, all the women's groups, the youth groups. All the people were brought to consider and to shape this charter, which was like a manifesto of what the point and what the purpose and what the goal of the movement was. And Jack had in mind trying to do that in the United States, that we didn't have anything in the early part of this century, in 2001, 2002, particularly after 9/11, that really would serve that function of being a focal point that we could all discuss, we could all agree on, no matter what our particular area of concern, immediate concern, whether it was civil rights or women's movement or peace or LGBT or media freedom. And so Jack had this idea, and at the time, early part of the 21st century there, I was at Stony Brook University and the director of the Center for Study of Working Class Life. And we had every 2 years a conference called How Class Works. And it was an international conference, brought people from around the world. And I invited Jack to come and be a keynote speaker for that conference in 2004, where we gave Jack our award for lifetime contributions to social justice for working people. And Jack, in his speech, gave an outline of this democracy charter, which he thought would be an important project for progressive forces in the United States to undertake, modeled on what happened in South Africa. And that democracy charter, in his initial formulation, is reproduced in a pamphlet that we produced called The Fierce Urgency of Now, and I'll sort of hold that up. I don't know if people can see. There's Jack on the cover. At that time, we published that, and a group of people around the country started thinking about it and trying to figure out how to get all the different organizations and different constituencies to consider, to debate, to think through the content of such a democracy charter, thinking that eventually we could pull together, again, some kind of a national people's assembly that would endorse it, would adopt it, and then it would become the sort of point of orientation that we could take to all parts of the country and all parts of the movement as what we were about as a unified whole, rather than just in our own particular, I guess what we now call silos. And that was the idea of the democracy charter. And it is still there, it's up, and I think one of the things that we're hoping will follow through from this call is people taking on the task of making that democracy charter a real force in American political life. And that's something I think we will be getting to before we're done with this call.
One of the things that everyone seems to point to with Jack is a good listener, a very modest person, great thinker, but and not very self-promotional. But there's another piece that I'd be interested in some thoughts on about Jack and younger people and Jack and new social movements. And Jane, I was wondering about Jack's continued interest and involvement with younger activists, and if you could say something about that.
Institute for Community Leadership. You say what?
No, we didn't hear you.
Oh, okay. He was very grateful to have the connection with this Institute for Community Leadership, which was founded by people who had been in a Seattle organization affiliated with the Rainbow Coalition. So they had met Jack in, I guess, the mid-'80s in connection with the Rainbow. And they went on to, through several identities, went on to eventually found this Institute for Community Leadership, which was aimed to prepare young people to, let me see, it was something like develop democracy, support peace. It had three major pillars. And they took Jack as their mentor and the person whose guidance they wanted, and they established a center outside of Seattle in Kent, Washington, called the Dell Center, and they would come up here and they would bring young people up here, or occasionally we would go down there and help them in their work any way we could with the young people. And they're still doing that. They've developed a very, I think, probably more active base of activity in Oakland, California now. They spend a lot of time there. But that they consciously and deliberately study. They spend a week between Christmas and New Year's studying the writings of Dr. King, but they also, their center is called the Jack O'Dell Center. They have a very good library there, which features, of course, anything they could find by Jack, and a lot of that kind of books that for people that have access to who might not otherwise see those books. So that was a great blessing for Jack to have people actually doing the kind of work that he had envisioned and involving him in doing it, and bring the young people up here to meet Jack and to consult with him. And he always, whenever he was with young people, made a point of asking them what they thought, what their problems were, what their predictions were. So it was always wonderfully nourishing for him, and they became the greatest source of that after we moved up here.
Leslie, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, thank you. I'm a generation younger than Jack. I think a number of us on this call might be. And I was well aware, working very closely with Jack, that he was older than me, that he had more experience, as an organizer. He had more experience certainly on the international front. He had a whole lot more experience. And yet I never felt from him that he was uninterested in what I and other people my age and younger had to say. He was always seeking out our input and our questions. And there was never a question that was kind of off limits. He might not answer at the moment, but he was always interested in hearing what we were thinking and what our questions were. And I think that I saw that not only in terms of my generation, but I saw that in terms of how he interacted with people younger than me. And I think that I came to understand that Jack himself, as a long distance runner, fully understood that the struggle we are engaged in, not only is it not easy, it's not quick. The kinds of changes we're talking about, the profound systemic changes that Jack was committed to, and that we're all committed to, all of us on this call today, I believe, are committed to, meant that this was a lifelong struggle, and in fact, a struggle that went beyond, that would go on beyond our own lives. So it wasn't just that Jack found young people interesting and exciting. I think he also understood that the struggle had to live on, and that meant nurturing, and both listening to and nurturing generations younger than he was, but always, again, with people of any age and wherever they were coming, whatever communities they were coming out of, always listening and mindful of people with the utmost respect, and trying to pull out what was the best contribution that everybody could make to the benefit of the whole. Again, as I've said before, never compromising his own principles and his own political commitments, but always opening up space for people. And I think for a lot of people who were younger than Jack, that was an incredible learning experience. Not that he did a workshop and taught us how to do it, but actually standing shoulder to shoulder with him, working on projects, working on activities, working in different arenas, we learned by his experience.
We are in a moment, a very peculiar moment in history. The leading candidate for the Democratic nomination is being red baited, and we should expect that red baiting will increase in tempo and scope. And I wondered, what can we learn from Jack's life and work about red baiting, and about how to deal with it and how not to deal with it? And I wanted to start, Jim, with asking you that, and then ask other panelists about this.
I think what Jack recognized over the many years we worked together was something I call generational page turning. It's the young generation that turns the page of history and struggle and learns from the older people. I want to comment on two things. One that Jean said, and Sharon added to that without knowing it. He had an ability to listen, and he took notes on his yellow pad. And if I can name drop, I want to give the best characterization of Jack and his anchoring, insightful role was a comment that Ossie Davis always made whenever we met. He would always ask about Jack, and he described Jack with a question. He would say, "Is Jack still that old man taking notes from the back of the meeting?" And I say, "Yeah, he's still taking notes." But generational page turning is what he recognized as the generation of Esther and that group in the Southern Negro Youth Congress turned the page on the generation ahead of them. And she provided a page turner in freedom ways. And the SNCC and the young people of the 60s had a link and a continuity grounded in history, grounded in struggle, grounded in radicalism and new dress. And I listened to that apology of Chris Matthews today. I don't know what he said, but he was apologizing to Bernie Sanders. And I'm listening to this and I'm saying to my son, they're fighting Bernie more than they're fighting Trump. And it is red baiting. And it's against the most progressive old candidate who is attracting young people to turn the generational page of struggle. And it's interesting that an elder is attracting the youth of today. My son took me to a Bernie rally. When was that? About 4 nights ago. Last Saturday. They got me out of the house. And I was impressed in Charleston, South Carolina. It was a Bernie rally of over 300 people in an African-American church. Very diverse, predominantly young people, 99% young. I fell out of, Cornel West spoke at that meeting. And the essence of generational page turning continues. The Democracy Charter comes out of the long struggle of African-American history and struggle in this country. The Democracy Charter is a new version of the Bill of Rights. That was a new version in Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights. And now Jack is anchoring an opportunity for organizing today and that continuity of American radicalism that found its beginning in this hemisphere in the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and the American Revolution. We are still today fulfilling the promises of the American Revolution. That was what Martin meant when he said on the Mall that he brought a promissory note. That promissory note was written in the activities of those men who were slaveholders and enmeshed in a lot of contradictions. But there was a radical element in their contradictions. And the young people of today, interestingly, with this call for democratic socialism in the United States, are doing a generational page turning with their activism. It won't be easy, but it will be difficult.
Nikhil, I want to ask you this red baiting, the issue about red baiting,
Mm-hmm.
and your thoughts about this, having reviewed Jack's life.
Jack was never apologetic about the choices he made politically, because I think he always made the choices he made out of a clear sense of moral principle. So if you said to Jack, what about Stalin? He would say, well, I don't know a single African-American person who joined the Communist Party because of Stalin. We joined the Communist Party because they were the only people who were with us in the early 1950s, the only people who were really supporting us, the only people who really believed fully and unequivocally in racial equality. And Jack was a pragmatist. So when Jack thought a movement had lost its impetus or lost its capacity to actually move people or make a difference, he himself moved on. But he didn't move on in the mode of denunciation or renunciation like so many did, in order to secure that for themselves sinecures in kind of higher echelons of power where they could sort of be experts who were once on the left who now denounce the left. Jack was always on the left, but he always understood being on the left as being on the side of the great majority. That's where the science comes in. But he also understood it as a commitment to moral principle that could not be broken, which was the question of justice. And so Jack was guided in some ways by some very, very clear ideas. And he never lost a kind of understanding of those clear ideas. He never broke from those clear ideas. And I think that's one of the things that we really are seeing right now with Bernie. I mean, Bernie has been consistent throughout his career on his position, so much so that he will go on 60 Minutes after winning a huge landslide in Nevada and basically say, you know, I'm not going to denounce everything about Fidel Castro. I'm actually going to acknowledge that the Cuban Revolution made enormous strides in education, literacy, and healthcare for its population. And these are not things that we can look askance at, particularly given the corruption of politics in Latin America, where there weren't revolutionary movements and where US involvement and US despotism prevailed. So Bernie is very, very clear, and they can go after him again and again and again. And young people today who did not grow up with red baiting, you know, who grew up mainly after the end of the Soviet Union, but maybe even know some of the history, look at it and say, you know, all of this is completely cynical. These attacks on him are completely cynical. He knows what he stands for. It's a clear moral principle. It's a clear sense of justice for the majority. So I think that Jack in many ways showed the way how you deal with red baiting. And that's why he could continuously move on to new levels of effectiveness in new movements, even when he was kind of caught up in it or people tried to catch him up in it. So
Gene,
that's how I would try to answer that.
Thank you very much. Gene, when you and I first met Jack, I met him after you met him and through you. This was at a point when the Rainbow Coalition was dying.
Mm-hmm.
And Jack had a very strong vision for what he thought the Rainbow Coalition could have become. What was your sense in talking with him about what his analysis of what had happened and what needed to happen?
So in the office in 91, 92, 93, during that 94, during that period, was sort of the last moments in which it might have been possible to revive the rainbow that had evolved out of the '88 election. And Reverend was very reluctant, and there's been a lot written about it and so on. But Jack took a real leadership role in the office. Jesse Jr. was there, and Jack would very much support the staff and sort of challenging Jesse that we needed to have democracy. We needed to have real, alive, local chapters, and that was the way for the Rainbow to really exercise power. And just sort of trying to encourage Reverend to like let that flow as much as possible, and also mentor, in a way, support the staff and Jesse Jr. in sort of playing that role inside of the Rainbow in advocating for that kind of democracy. I think he was disappointed that then that didn't happen, obviously, but he did everything he could to raise that with Reverend and to support the staff in that fight.
We have about 20 minutes, and what I'd like to do is ask the panelists for final observations about Jack and his work, so that we have time at the end for mention that about the Democracy Charter and what Mike Zweig had referred to earlier. So I'd like the participants, the panelists, to offer us a few words, and I want to start, I'll go in reverse order. So start with Mike, and then Gene and Sharon going that way. In terms of overall thoughts about Jack and things that you may not have gotten a chance to say, but please keep your comments concise.
I think that what Nikhil just said about consistency is so very important in operating out of principle. And the other thing that came out of this discussion that I would like to just echo again is Jack's ability to listen and to think clearly about what people are saying and to ask good questions. As a leader, he wasn't just telling people what to do. As a leader, he was thinking with people, he was challenging people, he was asking questions. And those were attributes which allowed him to make the kinds of contributions that he made. And he also had, I think, a very clear connection between a theoretical and a values basis for his work and the work itself. And they reinforced one another and developed one another. And in this period where we have such difficult politics, I think we ought to pay close attention to those lessons.
Thank you. Gene?
I think there was this remarkable combination of somebody with a huge amount of knowledge and experience. But what you got when you were with Jack was his love and his compassion, his respect for you, and his leadership through listening. And it had a very powerful impact on you because he was never trying to impress you. He was trying to engage with you. And as an organizer, I think that is a model that we should all try to incorporate into the work that we do.
Sharon?
You know, everybody else has said things so eloquently. I just want to pick up on what Nikhil said about Jack being a pragmatist as relative to the 2020 presidential election. Our democracy is at stake, and Jack would always ask us questions of like, what is this group doing? What are the young people thinking, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that pragmatist in Jack would say that this is a call to action, and whether we support Bernie or whether we support somebody else, whatever we do, whether it's writing op-eds, whether it's debunking this red baiting, whether it's putting it in the historical context that Jack would have done, we all have a responsibility to every day between now and November 7th to do whatever we can to keep our eyes on the prize and recognize that we cannot allow Donald Trump to be a second-term president. And Jack, you know, we talked a lot about that, Jack and Jane and I, from the moment he became the president-elect.
Thank you. Leslie?
Sure. I mean, I totally agree with what Gene and Sharon and Michael have already said. I would just add two quick things. One is that Jack always understood, always had the big picture and understood that the details were also critically important, that you needed that combination of paying attention to the details of the work but not lose sight of the big picture. And I think that's also another important skill that I wish more organizers had. And then the second thing I would also add, again, as been said before, is that I think that that he really, as a committed leftist, as a radical, as a revolutionary, as a communist, small c, he also understood the critical importance of mass movements, and was, I think, always, and I know I learned from him a lot about this arena of trying to figure out the relationship between the left movements, the self-identified conscious left movements, and the mass movements, and that making the changes that need to be made, defending the gains that have been won, protecting the democracy we have, even with all of its limitations, to put it mildly. All of that was also important, as putting out a left perspective is. So always balancing those things. I know I personally, and I hope many, many other people will continue to learn from Jack's work about that kind of balancing act.
Thank you. James Campbell?
Oh, Jack had a brilliant ability to extract the question that was at the heart of the matter. And he does it in the essay, Learn Your Horn. In that parable, he leaves us with a question that is the threshold for struggle today. And that question is, how do people who were sold in the marketplace fit into a market economy?
Akil.
Yeah, everybody said such fantastic things. I would say maybe just briefly that Jack was the least cynical person I've ever met. And yet at the same time, he had absolute clarity about the tremendous forces arrayed against struggles for human justice. He recognized the tremendous entrenched power of capitalist interests. He recognized the long shadow that white supremacy had cast over our democratic horizon. And he understood how the forces of empire had shaped global inequalities for centuries. He had no illusions about power. And yet, unlike so many who become disillusioned in the face of continuous defeat, setback, fragmentation, dissolution of movement energies, Jack always was looking for the next moment, the next horizon, the next possibility of coalescence, the next opportunity to bring people together. And he did that, as so many have said in this really wonderful conversation, by listening to people. He made you feel like you were valuable when he talked to you, and he made you feel like you could actually do something wherever you were located. And he helped to bring that out of us. So a big picture, but then a capacity to really drill down into the moment and to find the opportunities and possibilities in the moment. And I think that, many of us have been waiting a long time. We're all at different stages of this fight in our own lives. We've been waiting for the wheel of American politics to turn. And, Jack was at so many turning points. He was at the moment in which Jim Crow broke, right? He was at the moment in which the Cold War ended. And he was at the moment, I think, that many of us now see as a false dawn, when we elected a Black president who ran on very much kind of left populist lines, but then did not govern that way. We've been waiting a long time, and Jack has always been there with us. And I think that if he were here now, he would look at this moment and the kind of energies, especially among young people rallying around a 78-year-old Democratic Socialist from Vermont, and he would say, wow, I have not spent my life struggling in vain, because these forces that I fought for are still moving.
Thank you. Jane?
What I see as one of the most valuable things that Jack brought is his capacity to look at new things, to look at new situations, to apply, as you were saying, apply his principles to new situations and take in things that he had not predicted or expected, but understand their significance and accept that and build on that. So I guess it was just that he was always learning, and he was always flexible within the boundaries of his principles and, his very basic, the things that made him Jack, his character, but within that to always adjust to take account of new situations and new combinations and new possibilities.
I want to thank the panel. I just take the luxury of offering a few words. I met Jack in 1990, shortly after Gene Bruskin and through Gene. And, you know, it's like, what do you say when you meet an icon? I mean, by that point, I knew who Jack was. I'd never met him. I don't think I'd ever seen a picture of him. But I knew of him and I knew of his importance. And I was introduced to him. And he wasn't the warmest person when we met. And I thought I had gotten on his wrong side, that I had said something or that he had heard something through the grapevine about me. And I didn't know what to do about that. You know, who knows what happened? Maybe he ate the wrong thing. Maybe it was some bad Indian food that night. But in either case, we became very, very close. And I found myself increasingly thinking of Jack as my uncle. In fact, he was very much like an uncle of mine who was also on the left. And one of the things, though, the difference between my uncle, his name was Arnold, and Jack, is that Jack, as each of you have said, could really listen. And not only would listen, because there's people that can listen, but you know that they're not really listening. The thing you knew about Jack, that he, in terms of why he was listening, is that he'd ask you good questions. And that's when you know you're dealing with a good listener. He would ask you questions, and he would ask me questions. And the last conversation that he and I had, it was me, him, and Jane on the phone about a month or two before he passed away. He had been ill, but in this discussion, I felt like he found new energy. And I don't mean because of me. Something happened, there was this energy, and I felt like I was talking to this young guy again. So I wasn't ready when he passed away. Because metaphysically, I kept hoping that this guy who had reached the age of 96 was still going to somehow beat the odds. But I think the thing that I think it's important for us all to keep in mind is that this was a tremendous run on his part. 96 years old, principled, on the left, and lovable as all get out. I mean, what else can someone say? It was an honor to have known him. So I want to thank each of you panelists. I want to thank you that have joined the program, the listeners and viewers. And I'm going to turn this over to Carl and to Mike with final notes about the Democracy Charter, and wish everyone the best, and keeping in mind that the struggle certainly continues.
Thank you,
Carl and Mike.
Maybe I'll just say a word to start following up on this Democracy Charter, because Carl Kramer and Jim Campbell and I and Leslie and other people, Bill, were working on the Democracy Charter in the around 2009, 2010, trying to develop it. It became something of a document that was being considered, and then it kind of fell away. And what we're trying to do now, and what we hope to be able to do, is to find a way to bring it back into conversation, to have real back and forth about it. And Carl, you have some infrastructure set up, I think, to help people do that. And so why don't you bring us into that?
So some of us here in San Francisco who have been continuing and holding political discussion groups on the Democracy Charter have created a website, asej.net, which has the text of the Democracy Charter on it, and it also has the contributions that have been made from the different study discussion groups. And we're inviting groups around the country to have house meetings, coffee klatches, to get together in studying the Democracy Charter. And the way Jack put it was that he had put the Democracy Charter out in the public domain for people to tear it apart, suggest how it should be changed, to add points to it, that he saw it as a living document that was a vehicle for creating these kind of in-depth political discussions and for developing cadre that that activists would get out of the silos of their single issue organizations and see the interconnectedness to other issues and see how these things are interrelated and have discussions about how to project a vision for how we are going to create a substantive democracy. I hope maybe that Brother James Campbell will kind of add on to how this is in the tradition, the traditions of grassroots organizing as it developed in the Black liberation struggle in the South, and it was also carried through in the farm worker movement, and civil rights struggles.
Well, we have 3 minutes, so we're not going to be able to do that. But why don't we just move towards wrapping up, Carl?
All right, and would you want to wrap it up, or should I say more about the follow-up meeting that we'll have on Friday, March 20th?
Please.
2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. This will be also a Zoom meeting to discuss how we'll continue on a building from a grassroots level, the discussions around the Democracy Charter, and then bringing it, percolating that up to the leadership of our national organizations that we're involved in, and building on having regional congresses of the people, those kind of people's assemblies that Jack envisioned that would build towards having a national discussion on a vision for a substantive democracy.
Thank you, Carl. And I want to just thank everyone as we move towards wrapping up. Thank you all for joining this program. And this was recorded, and it will be posted on the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism on their website. And I believe it will be available to be posted elsewhere. And this was a wonderful opportunity. It was an honor for me to be the moderator. And I want to thank everyone for joining us, and have a great evening, and let's win. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Bill. Good
night.
work.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Well, so I am assuming that we will be sending out this information, a link to the recording as well as the information about that Carl presented to all the people who registered, even those who weren't able to join us. We did set up an email list, right, Carl?
Yes, we have the email list, and you've added on the pre-registrations that came in at the last minute, right?
I will. Don't send anything to the list until I tell you I've done it.
Okay, beautiful.
Thanks, everyone. This was terrific.
All right, I'm going to stop recording now.